to set the scene, just so everyone knows, on the interview right now is Phil Hall. You are a host, an author, an editor. Really, the list goes on and on and on. But what we're here to talk about today is one of your most recent books, 100 Years of Wall Street Crooks. Did I get that title right?
You got it perfect.
So I have read through this, and it goes all the way from how we've heard about the term Ponzi scheme. I believe one of your first one was Charles Ponzi, and then you talk about other big ones such as Belfort, Madoff. I think the most recent one was Elizabeth Holmes. Literally just over the past 100 years, crazy Wall Street crooks. And one that I'm so glad that you were able to join today, just because right now there's so much talk with the chair Gensler of the SEC. Could you tell us a little bit about Joseph Kennedy and really the history of the SEC? Because until I read your book, I literally had no clue. And with every single paragraph, like my jaw was just getting closer and closer to the floor. So once again, thank you for joining us today. But I think the audience, I think the world, more of the world needs to know about the history of the SEC.
Well, first of all, Joseph P. Kennedy, most people, if they recognize the name, he was the father of President John F. Kennedy and Senators Robert Kennedy and Ted Kennedy and the whole Kennedy family political dynasty. But he was actually one of the most famous and perhaps infamous characters of the early 20th century. He was a very prominent Wall Street investor. And if you're going back to the late 1910s, into the 1920s, there was no regulation on Wall Street. It was basically the Wild West of the financial services world. And Kennedy freely admitted that he had made his fortune with insider trading and with pump and dump schemes. In fact, at one point, one of his friends quoted him as saying that we better all get in on this before somebody passes a law. And nobody passed a law. And of course, 1929 came about. When 1929 came, Kennedy realized that the market was overvalued and he had already started getting his money out of it. He was not hurt by the Wall Street crash. A lot of people were. And it wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932 and sworn into office in 1933 that any serious reform of the financial services world took place, including the Securities and Exchange Act of 1933, which created the Securities and Exchange Commission. Now, Kennedy was a Democrat, and he was a major contributor to Roosevelt's campaign for president. And this wasn't basically purely altruistic. Kennedy was an ambitious individual, and he wanted political power as well as financial power. The problem was that in the early 1930s, there was an extraordinary bias against Roman Catholics in the United States. In fact, in 1928, a man named Alfred Smith, who was the governor of New York, ran for president as the Democratic candidate. He was the first Roman Catholic to run as a candidate for president, and he was the subject of some of the most vicious and scurrilous attacks based on his faith. So Kennedy realized that if he wanted to become a national political figure, he was going up against this kind of environment. But if he could work within Roosevelt's administration, he would be able to get the power that he wanted. Now, Roosevelt was a very good judge of character, and he realized that Kennedy, although he was very generous with his money, was a rather sketchy character, and he didn't want him in his cabinet. You realize, of course, cabinet positions have to be confirmed by the Senate. And a lot of the Southern senators were skeptical of Roman Catholics. So Kennedy was agitating to get a role within the administration, and Roosevelt was sort of equally adamant to try to keep him out. In fact, he actually arranged for Kennedy to work with his son, James Roosevelt, after Prohibition was lifted in 1933 on one of the first licenses to legally import alcohol to the U.S. And Kennedy was appreciative, but he realized he was trying to be set aside. And he said, no, he really wanted to be part of the administration. So Roosevelt made him the first commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which did not require congressional approval at the time. And this astonished a lot of people because Kennedy was known and it was infamous for being a pump and dump scammer back in the 20s.
So the SEC was created under Roosevelt and
Yes.
Joseph Kennedy, a guy who apparently the world knew was an insider trader and pump and dump. Like, he was the first guy who made this entire thing the world already knew was the guy taking advantage of the system. Like,
Yeah.
that's so ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous.
By today's standards, it's ridiculous, but you have to realize in 1933, or in this case, 1934, uh, Kennedy knew all the tricks. And he wasn't going to take over the SEC to allow his friends to continue with the pump and dump scams. He actually knew who was doing what, how they were doing it, and he wrote the laws to prevent it. So it's like it takes a thief to catch a thief. That's what happened. And so he was there. He was only there for 1 year, the first year of the SEC's history, but it was under him, of all people, that we're able to have the foundation of a properly regulated securities environment.
That is just, it's so funny because in real time, we talk about it of, okay, like what's going on, fighting these crooks, the SEC, some people think they do too much, other people don't think that they're doing enough. And then it dawned on me, especially as I was going through your book, of like the history of it. Like, I don't think any of us really thinking around be like, oh, how did it get started? Why was it started? And the reality of how it came to be. Like, this story is something that it's one of those things that I don't think if it was just made up out of thin air and be like, that's not believable. But the fact that it actually played out that way, that's just ludicrous to me. And once again, folks, this is all in the book, 100 Years of Wall Street Crooks. And so the way the book is set up, it's like all these little breakdowns of important things within Wall Street. Speaking of that, did you have like a personal favorite as you were researching this? Was there one that you were just like, I cannot believe this is how it played out, or for another reason just really resonated with you?
Well, there were so many of these people because they're not everybody was 100% evil. Some of them actually had rather good qualities. There was a con artist out of Texas named Billy Sol Estes who cheated a lot of people with various flim-flam schemes, but he was a supporter of Martin Luther King Jr. And he actually met Dr. King at one point and gave him a suitcase full of money to help finance the crusade for civil rights. It didn't help Billy Solestis when he was eventually caught and went to prison, but still, it's nice to know there are people out there who are not entirely evil, and some of them have a bit of a good side, even though the bad qualities outweigh the good qualities.
That's a very interesting point. I think, especially now with the hyper polarization of politics, there's this urge to group people like all good, all bad. In reality, it's the gray area in between. So you brought up an interesting point right there where, like, okay, in the terms of Wall Street, probably did some things not so good, but he also had good qualities to him. Who do you think, maybe not even in the past 100 years, but I'm just sure in your research, was there a particular person that on the flip side of it, you're like, this is like a bad person that you're like, hands down, I don't know if there's like a redeemable aspect, or were you able just to find even like maybe a silver lining on every person?
It's hard to say. I mean, a lot of these people are, and this is a word that does not come up in contemporary conversation a lot, were scoundrels. I mean, they did bad things. They broke the law. They knew they were breaking the law, but there was just something about them that was sort of charismatic. I mean, you don't look at somebody who robs a convenience store as being a charming person or being somebody that you're fascinated with. But when you have somebody who can orchestrate a multi-million-dollar swindle, it takes a lot of chutzpah, for lack of a better word, to pull that off. And you have to admire the fact that here are people, well, they went the wrong way, but they went in such a brilliantly reckless way. They didn't think small, they thought big.
Yeah.
And some of them thought they could get away with it. A couple of them did to a certain extent, like Howard Hughes. He went to take over an airline through rather reckless means. He never went to prison for it. He was never even indicted for it. But if you know Howard Hughes' life, he sort of created his own prison with his erratic behavior, and his final years were something you wouldn't wish on anybody.